Welcome back, class. Chapter 17 here, and again, this is working capital management, but this time we're talking about the float. And when we say the float, we're talking about the difference in time between the time that something shows up in the book balance and the time that it shows up in the available balance in the bank. So there may be two ways that that float will operate, and we're going to talk about that here. First of all, we want to go back a little bit and talk about why we would want to hold cash. And John Maynard Keynes, a great economist, who basically has, everybody follows Keynes whether they acknowledge it or not. But he identified three reasons why liquidity is important: a speculative motive, a precautionary motive, and a transaction motive. Speculative motive is a need to hold cash in order to take advantage of certain things, like bargain purchase that might happen or something of that nature. The precautionary motive is the idea that you need a cushion for some kind of emergency or a need that might arise, and so you want to hold on to some cash. And then the transaction motive, which is really to pay your bills. You need to have cash available to pay for bills or pay for those things that you owe. So the float is basically, there works two ways. One is a disbursements float. When you write a check and you send it out, you identify that you have sent the check out, but the bank may not recognize that right away. So here you've got a balance of $100,000, and a book balance of $100,000, and the available balance to the bank of $100,000. If you wrote a check for $100,000 on June 8th and sent it out, you would have a zero book balance, but you'd have available balance still of $100,000. In other words, the check hasn't cleared the bank yet, so you have a bit of a float. Now, there's a little bit of a benefit in that, but that would be simply that these cash funds can be temporarily invested in some other security and earn a little bit of interest. So the float, then, you can calculate the float that way, but you can also calculate a different kind of float, which would be a collection float. That is, you may have a book balance of 100 here and available balance of 100 here, but when you collect a check for 100,000, your book balance automatically goes up to 200, but your available balance to the bank still stays at 100, which means you are on the negative side of the float here. So you have a net effect between the collection and disbursements floats to figure out basically what the difference you have. Now, strategically, firms manage the float, but there are times when that management of the float can actually create the appearance of unethical behavior and really some kind of anyway, there are some issues with it. But basically, when we talk about float management, we're looking at things like mailing time, processing delay, and availability delay. That means how long a check takes to clear, how long it is until it's available in our accounts. The ethical and legal questions I briefly touched on earlier, but ethically, what is it ethical to play the float and actually do that kind of thing? There was a case in the 80s with E.F. Hutton, who pled guilty to mail and wire fraud in a scheme where they wrote checks against uncollected cash. So what they did is they then turned that cash around and invested it in short-term money market assets. That was a systematic overdrafting, and it was intentional, and it's basically a fraud. It's called kiting, check kiting. It's not legal. It's not ethical. So you have to figure out, there's a fine line between actually managing the float and doing something like that with the float. So one of the issues that's come into play recently is this electronic data interchange, and Check 21 is the float actually coming to an end, because as we go through the process of more and more electronic payment processing, float management might go away or it might be reduced in its importance, because there will be less and less delays. If it's an electronic processed payment, typically it'll go through within a day or so. With that in mind, we are looking at components of cash collection and concentration. As you collect cash, there are many ways to do this. One way that a firm might do this, if they're still receiving mailed checks, is to have lock boxes around the country. Rather than have one central location for cash collection, they may have a series of lock boxes around the country where their bank actually has the lock box, and as soon as it comes in, they deposit it into that particular account. That would reduce the float time or reduce the collection time for that particular business. That is one way of dealing with it. So they will have, many firms have a number of different cash collection points, and they may be in different bank accounts in different places. And so what they need to do is be able to move that into its main accounts and into what they call cash concentration. So here's a schematic or a map, a flow chart, if you will, of how that would work and what they would do. They have a concentration bank, and where they actually the cash manager and the firm is actually monitoring that. So managing cash disbursements is another issue. You're going to have to figure out how to manage those. Some of the tactics you can debate whether they're ethical or not, but delaying payments or playing afloat with the payments it could be done and may be done in some cases. But usually a supplier is not going to be fooled if you're trying to slow down payment. The problem is, if you slow down payment too much, you wind up with negative consequences because your relationship with the supplier is very important to your continued profitability. So, if a company has something they call a zero balance account, the firm, in cooperation with the bank, is basically maintaining an account and a set of sub-accounts, that when a check written on one of the sub-accounts is paid, the funds are automatically transferred in from a master account. This is a lot like a PayPal account. You don't actually have any cash in it, but you authorize the transfer of the cash into that account from your account. So when you want to buy something, the transfer is made to cover that payment. You also have this idea of controlled disbursement, where the bank informs the firm of the daily total and then transfers the amount needed into that account. Many times firms are very interested in investing idle cash simply because they can put that in securities and, on a temporary basis anyway, earn interest on it. If they have a temporary cash surplus, that would be an excellent place where they would want to do that. So if you were at a point where you had basically additional funds, surplus funds, you could put those in marketable securities when you don't need long-term financing. Short-term financing, but when you run into a shortage, you go to the bank for loans. When you have a surplus, you basically go back to marketable securities. You're going to manage cash in order that you can do that. They talk about short-term securities here, and they talk about the maturity rate or time period where you're actually going to have that invested. What kind of default risk is there? Are they marketable and are they taxable? There are different kinds of money market certificates you can get. So they look at that here and they talk about them here. When we're talking about credit and receivables, well, when you sell goods, you're going to usually have an accounts receivable of some kind. because many of the customers you're going to deal with are going to be interested in acquiring a regular payment cycle, so that when you actually sell them something at one time during the month coming up, they'll be able to write those checks and pay those bills. So when we look at credit policy, the company that's making the sale, if they decide to grant credit, they're going to consider, well, what are the terms? What is our credit analysis? And if we grant credit, we need to figure out how much effort how much effort we spend in deciding who's going to pay and who won't. And then we decide what our collection policy is after we actually make the sale. But the credit period then is the bank length of time that we grant credit for. That period will vary widely from industry to industry, and some industries require longer periods than others. And the question is, are we going to include a cash discount involved if they pay early or something of that nature? So when we're talking about an invoice date, that's the date where the credit period begins. So that's the date when the invoice is issued. The customer officially has the merchandise, and we have a receivable from them. So the length of the credit period then begins at that point. When we're dealing with this, we need to think about several things that influence the credit period. Some of those include perishability and collateral value. So if we sell perishable items, they're going to have a relatively quick turnover, and there's no or low collateral value. So our credit period needs to be short if we're selling perishable items. So if you're selling produce to a grocery store, you need a very tight turnaround on that collectability period. Also, is the consumer demand very high? If there's a very high demand, then you need a quick turnover. If you have slower moving products, you may need longer credit periods. Cost and profitability. If it's relatively inexpensive goods, like if you're selling a lot of things at Walmart, you're going to have a shorter turnaround period, shorter credit period. But if you have relatively expensive goods, then it's going to be a longer credit period. So, for example, if you're talking about automobiles compared to consumables like they sell at Walmart or at a grocery store, there's going to be a big difference in the credit period on those two things. You also want to think about the size of the account. How big is it? If it's a smaller account, it'll probably be a shorter length of time on credit. And what kind of customers are you selling this to? Now, cash discounts are usually part of the terms of the sale and are usually offered in order to encourage early payment on the account. So like if you have a 2%, 10, net 30, basically the buyer is going to look at that and say, well, I can save 2% if I pay it in 10 days. So that's the greatest possible leveraging I could get. Or if they want the longest possible delay in payment, they wait 30 days and pay. So so here what we're talking about, they're actually going to calculate an effective annual interest rate when they're looking at what they're doing. So this is an example. You can pay $980 in 10 days or wait another 20 days and pay $1,000. What it really means is that the buyer is borrowing $980 for 20 days and you pay $20 in interest on the loan. So what's the interest rate? Well, the effective annual rate is shown here in the calculation. So if you look at that, if you're trying to save the $20, it's really kind of an expensive thing because you're paying an effective annual interest rate of 44% basically on that amount. So what that means is you have a pretty high motive to basically pay that early, because if you don't pay it early, it's like financing the $980, at a 44% rate. So that's really high. So again, those discounts, you need to think about them in that way. Credit instrument is credit instrument is the evidence of indebtedness. So trade credits on an open account typically may have a promissory note, but they would be signed after the delivery of the goods typically. So when we look at the total cost of credit, it produces a curve sort of like this, which involves the carrying costs and the opportunity costs. So you're kind of at this intersection here. This is the optimal place, optimal amount of credit. So credit analysis, well, you can look at that in the financial statements, credit reports. Banks will provide some assistance, and then the customer's payment history. So the credit evaluation scoring. You talk about credit scores a lot, but here's what you wind up with when you're evaluating credit worthiness. You have character, the customer's willingness to meet the obligation, the capacity, can they pay it, the capital, how much reserve do they have, the collateral, what kind of assets do they have, and the conditions, and general economic conditions in that customer's line of business. Credit scoring basically calculates a numerical rating for information that places collect. Credit scoring models basically determine who and who isn't credit worthy, and there's a lot that could go into that. Okay, we really want to talk about monitoring receivables. Typically, business is going to have an aging process for aging its receivables. You're going to look at how much you have in receivables at different points in time, at different ages of the accounts, and then you're going to basically set a collection policy and collection effort where you go through a series of steps. You basically use letters, telephone calls, maybe employ a collection agency, and then finally, if nothing happens, you may go into legal action against the customer. We have inventory management here that they're going to talk about, and inventory costs. When you're looking at inventory costs, you want to think about how much is it costing you to track and store the inventory, what insurances are there that you need to carry and taxes you pay on it, and what losses could occur due to obsolescence or deterioration of the inventory. And then what's the opportunity cost of the capital that's invested in that inventory. So there are several ways to manage inventory, and they talk about an ABC approach, which is dividing the inventory into 3 groups, and you're tracking them in groups. There is this economic order quantity model. It's a calculation that you can use basically to establish an optimal inventory level. Back here where they're grouping them into 3 units, you're going to separate inventory that's different from each other. And so with the economic order quantity, what you're looking at is what you're ordering for each type of item. What kind of costs are there in holding inventory? So to develop an EOQ, or economic order quantity, you assume that the inventory is being sold off at a steady rate until it's 0, and then they restock the inventory back to its optimal level. So when you're doing that, it looks something like this. You start with this inventory, you sell it down to 0, you restock, sell it to 0. So when we get to the economic order quantity, what we're looking at here is the quantity, which is the most economic to order, is going to be the square root of 2 times the total number of units that we order during the year, times the restocking cost, or the cost per order. That's what it's going to cost us every time we get an order in, divided by the carrying cost. So we take the square root of all of this, which is actually the square root of 6,240,000, and that means we have 2,498 units, which is the economic ordering quantity. That's what we need to order in order to minimize the cost of restocking and carrying costs. To get another example of that here in 17.3 and 4 and 5, you can go through that if you would like. Safety stock is where we actually say, well, we don't want to wait until we get down to 0. We're going to order it when we hit a safety stock number so that we don't run out. If we were letting it go down to 0, it would be a time period where we wouldn't be able to sell anything. So we need to factor into the safety stock calculation how long it takes to deliver it, so that we order at a point before we run out and actually hit the safety stock limit. So we have a reorder point here before we sell out down to the safety stock. So there's a combination where you need to think about the safety stock level. That is, this is the level you want to keep on hand at all times so you don't run out. But then you need to time it so that you get the order in before you get below the safety stock. And that's a reorder point, and that's what they're calculating there. So materials requirements planning, which is basically what you're trying to figure out. What are the materials I require, and when can I get those in? Just-in-time inventory basically is a way of managing and minimizing inventories and maximizing the turnover. So just-in-time inventory system is basically trying to time it so that you actually have inventory just in time needed to sell it or needed to provide it to the people that are your customers. So that's really it for chapter 17. For the homework here in 17, the problems, the chapter problems, you're going to have number 1. And number 1 is a question of calculating float. Here it is. This is talking about float on deposits with no outstanding checks or unclear deposits. You're writing a check. What is that float? What is that? A disbursement float or collection float? You have another one here that's going to be, what is that? It's a deposit. You're depositing a check. Is it a disbursement float or collection float? And then you have, with number 10, you're going to get into dealing with the size of accounts receivable. You have weekly credit sales and average collection period. What is their average accounts receivable number? You can actually calculate that if you know how to calculate receivables turnover and that sort of thing. Then you wind up with number 16, which is safety stocks and order points, was the last thing we talked about. Alright, that's chapter 16, and again, I apologize for the lateness of this video. If you need extra time to revise your problems, please let me know. Otherwise, hopefully this helps you, and have a great weekend.